The wind was shifting from southwest to northwest, and James Stagg had maybe 4 hours before Eisenhower would make the final irreversible decision to launch Operation Overlord with weather that could kill thousands of paratroopers before they reached the ground. He stood in the meteorology room at Southwick House, staring at pressure charts that showed storm systems converging over the English Channel, calculating whether a brief window of marginally acceptable conditions would open on June 6th, or whether the invasion fleet should remain in port while weather that was currently terrible became catastrophically worse. Every senior meteorologist in Allied command was telling Eisenhower that the weather was unacceptable for invasion, and Stagg agreed with their assessment, but he also saw pattern in the data that suggested a temporary improvement that might last 18 to 36 hours before conditions deteriorated again. The invasion had been scheduled for June 5th and had already been postponed once because weather forecasts predicted conditions too severe for amphibious operations. The postponement had created enormous logistical complications. Thousands of troops loaded onto ships were experiencing seasickness and deteriorating morale. Naval forces maintaining station were consuming fuel that couldn't be easily replaced. The entire invasion machinery that had been set in motion couldn't remain poised indefinitely without degrading readiness that successful assault would require. Eisenhower needed the invasion to proceed, but needed weather that wouldn't doom the operation before it began, needed meteorological advice that balanced operational necessity against atmospheric reality that didn't care about military timetables. Stagg was chief meteorologist for the invasion, and his responsibility was providing Eisenhower with weather forecasts accurate enough to inform the most consequential military decision of the war. The responsibility was crushing because weather prediction in 1944 was more art than science, was extrapolation from incomplete data rather than precise calculation, was professional judgment applied to atmospheric conditions that could shift unpredictably in ways that would make forecasts wrong regardless of how carefully they had been constructed. Stagg had to predict weather for operation involving 156,000 troops crossing body of water where conditions could change catastrophically in hours, had to be confident enough in his predictions to advise commander who would base irreversible decisions on forecasts that might be completely wrong. The meteorological situation was extraordinarily complex because multiple weather systems were interacting in ways that made prediction uncertain. A strong, low-pressure system was moving across the Atlantic, bringing wind and rain that would make amphibious landings nearly impossible. Behind that system was temporary ridge of high pressure that might create brief window of improved conditions. But following the high-pressure ridge was another low-pressure system that would bring renewed storms potentially worse than the current weather. The question wasn't whether good weather existed somewhere in the sequence, but whether the timing would align so that the brief improvement would coincide with the invasion schedule and would last long enough for initial assault waves to establish beachhead before conditions deteriorated. Stagg's forecast had to account for not just beach landing conditions, but also for airborne operations that would drop paratroopers behind German lines during darkness preceding the amphibious assault. The airborne operations required wind speeds low enough that paratroopers could land with acceptable accuracy, required cloud cover thin enough that transport aircraft could navigate to drop zones, required visibility sufficient that formations could maintain cohesion during the drops. The requirements were stringent, and the current conditions failed to meet any of them. Wind speeds were excessive, cloud cover was complete, visibility was nearly zero in precipitation that showed no signs of clearing. The other meteorologists advising Eisenhower were from American and British weather services, and they disagreed with each other about fundamental aspects of the forecast. The Americans were generally optimistic about the high-pressure ridge creating acceptable conditions on June 6th, were willing to predict that the window would open and would remain open long enough for invasion to succeed. The British meteorologists were more pessimistic, were emphasizing the uncertainties in the forecast and the risks of launching operation during marginal conditions that could deteriorate without warning. Stagg had to synthesize these conflicting assessments into unified recommendation that Eisenhower could act upon, had to make judgment call about which analysis was more likely to be correct when the data supported multiple interpretations. The pressure charts Stagg was examining showed the low-pressure system beginning to move faster than previous forecasts had predicted. The acceleration suggested the storm might clear the channel area by early June 6th, might create the window that would allow invasion to proceed. But the acceleration also introduced uncertainty, because if the system slowed or stalled, conditions would remain unacceptable and the invasion would be launched into weather that would cause catastrophic casualties. Stagg had to decide whether the apparent acceleration was real atmospheric change or was artifact of incomplete data, had to judge whether he was seeing actual improvement or was seeing pattern that would disappear in next set of observations. The forecast meeting with Eisenhower was scheduled for 0400 hours on June 5th, and Stagg had 3 hours to finalize his recommendation. He reviewed all available data, surface observations from weather stations across Britain and from ships in the Atlantic, upper air soundings from weather balloons, reconnaissance reports from aircraft that had flown through the storm systems gathering direct measurements. The data was incomplete because German occupation of European coast eliminated observation stations that would have provided critical information about conditions developing over the continent, because submarine warfare had reduced the number of weather ships that could operate safely in the Atlantic, because aircraft reconnaissance was limited by range and by combat operations that restricted where weather flights could safely operate. Stagg constructed his forecast through combination of data analysis and professional judgment developed through decades of meteorological experience. The data suggested conditions would improve, but didn't prove improvement was certain, or that improvement would last long enough. The judgment was that the high-pressure ridge was real and was moving at speed that would create acceptable conditions by dawn on June 6th, was judgment based on understanding atmospheric dynamics and on recognizing patterns that data alone couldn't definitively establish. Stagg decided to recommend proceeding with invasion on June 6th, despite knowing that his recommendation might be wrong, and that being wrong would contribute to failure of operation that entire Allied war effort depended upon. The meeting began precisely at 0400 hours in Southwick House Library that had been converted to Operations Center. Eisenhower was present along with senior commanders who would execute the invasion and who needed to understand weather conditions that would affect their operations. Stagg presented his forecast with careful attention to both the predicted improvement and the uncertainties that made the prediction fallible. He told Eisenhower that conditions would improve enough by June 6th to attempt the invasion, but that the improvement would be temporary and that weather would deteriorate again within 36 hours. The forecast was qualified and cautious, but it represented professional judgment that invasion could proceed with acceptable risk rather than certain disaster. The other meteorologists present offered their assessments, and several disagreed with Stagg's recommendation. The American meteorologist thought conditions would be better than Stagg predicted and would last longer, thought the forecast was overly pessimistic, and that Eisenhower should have confidence that weather would support the operation. The British meteorologist from the Admiralty was more pessimistic than Stagg, thought the forecast window was too uncertain, and that invasion should be postponed until more reliable conditions developed. The disagreement among meteorologists made Eisenhower's decision more difficult because it revealed that weather prediction was subjective judgment rather than objective science, revealed that experts examining same data reached different conclusions about what would happen. Eisenhower questioned Stagg directly about his confidence in the forecast, and Stagg was honest that confidence was limited, that meteorology in 1944 couldn't provide certainty that commanders wanted, that the forecast was professional best estimate rather than definitive prediction. The honesty was necessary, but wasn't what Eisenhower wanted to hear, because he needed confidence that would justify committing 156,000 troops to operation that weather might doom. But Stagg understood that false confidence would be worse than honest uncertainty, that Eisenhower needed realistic assessment of risks rather than reassurance that would prove false if forecast was wrong. Eisenhower made tentative decision to proceed with invasion on June 6th, pending weather updates that would come in subsequent hours before the final irrevocable commitment when ships began sailing toward France. The tentative decision created new pressure for Stagg because he would have to confirm or revise his forecast as new data arrived, would have to advise whether conditions were developing as predicted or whether unexpected changes required reconsideration of the invasion timing. The meteorological situation remained fluid, and forecasts made hours earlier could become obsolete as atmospheric conditions evolved in ways that observations would reveal only gradually. The hours between the 0400 meeting and final decision point were consumed by continuous data analysis as new observations arrived from weather stations and reconnaissance aircraft. Stagg monitored every update looking for information that would either confirm his forecast or indicate he had been wrong about how weather systems were evolving. The low-pressure system was indeed moving faster and was clearing the channel area as Stagg had predicted, was creating the window that would allow invasion to proceed. But the system's movement wasn't uniform. Some areas were clearing faster than predicted, while others remained under storm conditions that would make operations difficult. The final forecast meeting occurred at 04:15 on June 5th, and Stagg confirmed his earlier recommendation that invasion should proceed on June 6th. The conditions weren't ideal, but they were acceptable for amphibious operations, and for airborne drops, were sufficient that invasion had reasonable probability of success rather than near-certain probability of catastrophic failure. Eisenhower accepted the recommendation and gave the order that set invasion irrevocably in motion. Ships began sailing from ports across southern England. Paratroopers began boarding aircraft that would drop them over Normandy during darkness. The entire massive operation that had been delayed began executing according to plans that weather would either support or destroy. The invasion launched on schedule during early morning hours of June 6th, and initial weather conditions matched Stagg's forecast closely enough that operations proceeded without weather-related disasters. The winds were stronger than ideal, but were manageable. The cloud cover was broken rather than complete, allowing some visual navigation. The visibility was adequate for paratroop drops and for naval gunfire support. The conditions weren't perfect, but they were sufficient, and the invasion succeeded in establishing beachhead despite fierce German resistance that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with combat. The weather window Stagg had predicted lasted approximately 30 hours before conditions began deteriorating as the next low-pressure system arrived. The deterioration affected reinforcement operations and supply delivery, but the initial assault had succeeded in establishing positions that subsequent weather couldn't eliminate. The timing had been extraordinarily fortunate. If invasion had been delayed to June 7th or later, the weather would have been catastrophically worse and might have prevented successful landing. If invasion had proceeded on June 5th as originally scheduled, the weather would have been unacceptable and casualties would have been substantially higher, possibly preventing successful beachhead establishment. Stagg's forecast had been accurate enough to matter, even though it hadn't been perfectly precise. He had predicted improvement when other meteorologists were predicting continued bad weather, had been correct that the high-pressure ridge would create brief window that would allow operations to proceed. The accuracy wasn't proof of superior meteorological skill because weather forecasting retained substantial uncertainty, and being right once didn't mean the same approach would be right consistently. But the accuracy had been consequential because it had influenced decision that determined timing of most important military operation of the war, had been one factor among many that made D-Day success possible. Eisenhower later acknowledged Stagg's contribution to invasion success, but also acknowledged that decision to proceed had been his alone, and that he would have borne responsibility if weather forecast had been wrong and invasion had failed. The acknowledgement was generous, but also accurate. Meteorologists could advise, but commanders had to decide, could provide information, but couldn't make judgments about whether risks were acceptable for operations that combined military and political considerations that went beyond weather prediction. Stagg had done his job by providing best available forecast. Eisenhower had done his job by making decision based on that forecast while accepting uncertainty that meteorology couldn't eliminate. The post-invasion analysis of weather forecasting accuracy showed Stagg's predictions had been remarkably good given limitations of available data and analytical methods. Modern meteorology, with satellite observation and computer modeling, can recognize that Stagg's forecast was based on identifying atmospheric patterns that existed but which were barely visible in the data available in 1944. The recognition provides retrospective validation, but doesn't diminish achievement of making accurate forecast with tools that were primitive compared to contemporary capabilities. The German meteorologists who were providing weather forecasts to Wehrmacht Command had completely missed the high-pressure ridge that created the invasion window. German forecasts predicted continued bad weather through June 6th and 7th, which meant German defenders weren't expecting Allied invasion during period when Stagg had correctly predicted conditions would briefly improve. The German forecasting failure was partly due to lack of Atlantic observation data. Allied control of Atlantic meant German weather services couldn't gather information about systems developing over ocean, but was also due to different analytical approaches that led German meteorologists to different conclusions about how weather would evolve. Stagg continued serving as chief meteorologist for Allied forces through remainder of war, but never faced another decision with consequences comparable to D-Day weather forecast. The subsequent forecasts were important for various operations, but none involved timing decision that would affect 156,000 troops, and that would determine whether invasion of occupied Europe would succeed or fail catastrophically. Stagg's professional reputation was established by getting the D-Day forecast right, even though his career included many other forecasts that were less dramatically consequential, but which required similar professional judgment applied to incomplete data. After war, Stagg returned to British Meteorological Service and continued working in weather forecasting until retirement in 1960. His career was distinguished, but not extraordinary beyond the D-Day forecast, which remained defining professional accomplishment. He rarely discussed the forecast publicly because operational details remained classified for decades, and because discussing his role seemed like claiming excessive credit for what had been collective effort involving many meteorologists and many military planners. The modesty was characteristic of Stagg's personality, but also reflected his understanding that weather forecasting was inherently uncertain, and that being right about D-Day had involved some luck along with professional skill. The forecast techniques Stagg used for D-Day prediction were standard meteorological methods for 1944, but would be considered primitive by modern standards. He had analyzed surface pressure patterns and upper air data, and had extrapolated from historical precedents about how similar patterns had evolved in the past. The techniques worked because atmospheric behavior has consistent patterns, even though specific outcomes remain uncertain. Worked because professional meteorologists developed intuition about weather systems through years of experience observing how forecasts compared to actual conditions. Modern computer models can perform similar analysis more quickly and with better accuracy, but the fundamental approach, identifying patterns and extrapolating probable evolution, remains similar to what Stagg accomplished with manual analysis of paper charts. The pressure that Stagg experienced while making D-Day forecast was remembered by him as most stressful professional experience despite career that included many high-pressure situations. The stress came from knowing that forecast error would contribute to catastrophic military failure, from understanding that being wrong would result in deaths that accurate forecast might have prevented. The stress wasn't unique to D-Day. All weather forecasts for military operations carried similar implications, but the scale of D-Day made the stakes extraordinarily visible and made the consequences of error impossible to minimize or rationalize away. Eisenhower's comment after successful invasion that weather had been the most important factor in invasion timing was probably overstatement influenced by relief that gamble on marginal conditions had succeeded. Military historians generally conclude that many factors contributed to D-Day success, and that weather was one important element but not uniquely decisive. But Eisenhower's comment revealed how uncertain he had been about weather forecast, and how much weight he had given to Stagg's recommendation when making decision to proceed. The uncertainty was reasonable, given that meteorology couldn't provide certainty, and given that launching invasion in bad weather would have substantially reduced probability of success. The window of acceptable weather that Stagg had predicted proved to be even briefer than his forecast had suggested. Conditions began deteriorating 30 hours after invasion launched, rather than 36 hours as predicted. The 6-hour error in timing was within acceptable forecast uncertainty, but it demonstrated how marginal the entire operation had been, how close the invasion came to occurring during weather that would have been unacceptable. If weather had deteriorated 6 hours earlier, reinforcement operations would have been disrupted in ways that might have allowed German counterattacks to succeed in pushing Allied forces back into the sea. Stagg's forecast notes and charts from D-Day decision period were preserved and eventually became historical documents studied by meteorologists and military historians interested in understanding how the weather decision was made. The notes reveal careful analytical process, but also reveal that Stagg's final recommendation was judgment call rather than conclusion that data definitively supported. The notes show him weighing conflicting indicators and reaching conclusion that combined data analysis with professional intuition about how atmospheric patterns would evolve, show decision-making process that combined science with art in ways that characterized weather forecasting throughout its history. The German failure to predict the invasion window had significant operational consequences beyond just the surprise achieved on June 6th. German forces were less prepared than they would have been if their meteorologists had predicted the weather improvement, were deployed, assuming continued bad weather would prevent Allied operations. The deployment decisions based on incorrect weather forecast affected German response during critical initial hours when Allied forces were most vulnerable and when German counterattacks might have been most effective. Stagg's forecast accuracy, combined with German forecast error, created asymmetric advantage that contributed to invasion success in ways that pure military factors alone couldn't have achieved. Modern meteorology continues studying the D-Day forecast as historical case study in decision-making under uncertainty and in communicating forecast uncertainty to operational commanders. The case study reveals tensions between what meteorologists can predict accurately and what military planners need to know for operational planning, reveals how forecasters must balance providing useful information against maintaining scientific honesty about forecast limitations. Stagg navigated those tensions successfully by being clear about forecast uncertainties, while also providing clear recommendation that Eisenhower could act upon, providing information that was useful for decision-making despite being scientifically uncertain. The Memorial to D-Day operations mentions meteorological forecasting briefly as background factor, but doesn't emphasize Stagg's specific contribution or the forecast decision's importance to invasion timing. The limited mention reflects that most military history focuses on combat operations, rather than on supporting functions like meteorology, focuses on what happened rather than on decisions that determined when events occurred. Stagg would probably have appreciated the limited prominence, given that his professional ethos emphasized providing accurate forecasts rather than seeking personal recognition for doing his job well. The Atlantic Weather Observation Network that Stagg relied upon for his forecast was substantially degraded compared to peacetime capabilities, because German occupation had eliminated European coastal stations, and because submarine warfare had forced Allied weather ships to reduce operations in areas where German U-boats operated. The degradation meant Stagg was working with approximately 40% less data than would have been available before the war, was making forecasts about weather systems crossing the Atlantic with observation gaps that could hide developing storms or pressure changes. The data limitations made accurate forecasting extraordinarily difficult and made Stagg's success at predicting the invasion window even more remarkable as professional achievement. The reconnaissance aircraft that flew weather missions to gather data for invasion forecasting operated at considerable risk because they had to penetrate areas where German fighters might intercept them and where weather conditions made flying dangerous even without enemy action. Several reconnaissance aircraft were lost during the weeks leading up to D-Day while gathering meteorological data that contributed to forecast decisions. The aircrew casualties were direct cost of maintaining observation network that invasion planning required, were deaths that served meteorological purposes rather than combat objectives. Stagg was aware of these costs and felt responsible for them even though he didn't order the missions or control their execution. The disagreement between American and British meteorologists about the invasion forecast reflected different national approaches to weather prediction that had developed through different training traditions and different operational experiences. American meteorologists tended toward optimism, partly because North American weather systems behaved differently than European systems, and partly because American military culture emphasized can-do attitudes that influenced how forecasters interpreted uncertain data. British meteorologists tended toward caution, partly because British military traditions emphasized thorough planning, and partly because British weather experiences had demonstrated how quickly conditions could deteriorate in ways that optimistic forecasts hadn't anticipated. Stagg's role as chief meteorologist required synthesizing these different approaches into unified forecast that Eisenhower could use for decision-making. The synthesis was politically delicate because it required finding middle ground between American optimism and British caution while maintaining scientific integrity about what data actually supported. Stagg achieved the synthesis by acknowledging uncertainty explicitly while providing clear recommendation about whether invasion should proceed, by being honest about forecast limitations while also being decisive about what the forecast meant for operational planning. The timing pressures that drove D-Day scheduling were a complex combination of military and political factors that went beyond weather considerations. Lunar and tidal conditions were important for amphibious operations and for airborne drops, creating narrow windows when dates were even potentially suitable regardless of weather. The moon needed to be nearly full to provide illumination for paratroop navigation, while also being early enough in night that darkness would still cover amphibious approaches. The tides needed to be suitable for landing craft and for exposing beach obstacles that engineers would demolish. These astronomical factors meant invasion could only occur on certain dates, and missing those dates would require waiting weeks for conditions to cycle back to suitable configuration. The pressure to proceed on schedule even with marginal weather came partly from recognition that delaying invasion would mean missing the June windows entirely and waiting until July when different operational challenges would arise. Summer weather in English Channel is generally better than spring weather, but July would mean longer days with less darkness for concealing invasion preparations, would mean different agricultural conditions in Normandy that would affect operations inland from beaches. Military planners preferred June timing if possible, and weather forecast became a critical factor in whether June remained viable or whether operations would have to be postponed to next suitable window. Stagg's forecast wasn't just about June 6th specifically, but about the entire invasion period, including subsequent days when reinforcements would need to be landed and when supplies would need to be delivered. The initial assault could succeed even with marginal weather, but sustained operations required conditions that would allow naval vessels to operate effectively and would allow construction of artificial harbors that invasion plan depended upon. Stagg had to forecast not just a single day, but a multi-day period when conditions would be adequate for complex amphibious campaign that extended far beyond initial beach landings. The artificial harbor construction that was crucial to invasion plan required relatively calm seas that would allow the massive concrete caissons to be towed across channel and positioned correctly. The caissons were so large that they couldn't be moved in rough weather and would be destroyed if caught in storms. Stagg's forecast had to account for whether weather would allow harbor construction to proceed during days immediately following invasion, or whether storms would prevent the installations that entire supply plan depended upon. The harbor requirement added another constraint to already complex forecast that had to balance multiple operational needs against atmospheric conditions that didn't care about military requirements. The post-invasion storm that arrived on June 19th was severe enough that it destroyed one of the artificial harbors and seriously damaged the other, demonstrating how vulnerable amphibious operations were to weather conditions. The storm vindicated Stagg's caution about forecast limitations and about how quickly channel weather could deteriorate from acceptable to catastrophic. If the storm had arrived a week earlier during initial invasion period, the consequences would have been devastating for Allied operations and might have prevented successful beachhead establishment. The timing of the storm emphasized how fortunate the weather window had been, and how narrow the margin between success and potential disaster actually was. Stagg's professional relationships with other senior meteorologists involved in invasion forecasting were complicated by the pressure and by the professional disagreements about how to interpret uncertain data. The disagreements were handled professionally, but they created tensions that persisted beyond D-Day as participants reflected on decisions they had made and on alternative interpretations that might have led to different recommendations. Several meteorologists who had advised against proceeding on June 6th remained convinced their caution had been warranted, even though Stagg's forecast had proved accurate, remained skeptical that the success validated optimistic interpretation of atmospheric data that could easily have evolved differently. The validation of Stagg's forecast through successful invasion could have been coincidental. Forecasts can be right for wrong reasons if atmospheric conditions happen to evolve as predicted, despite forecaster having misunderstood underlying dynamics. Stagg acknowledged this possibility in his post-war writings about the forecast, acknowledged that meteorological uncertainty meant even accurate predictions couldn't be considered definitive proof of forecasting skill. The intellectual honesty about forecast limitations was characteristic of Stagg's approach and distinguished him from meteorologists who claimed greater certainty than data supported or who attributed successful forecasts entirely to skill rather than acknowledging role of fortunate timing. The meteorological lessons from D-Day influenced post-war development of weather forecasting as military capability that required investment and institutional support. The invasion demonstrated that weather forecasting could have strategic consequences that justified treating meteorology as critical military function rather than as support service that could be handled adequately with minimal resources. The demonstration led to expanded weather services in both British and American military organizations and led to increased investment in observation networks and forecasting capabilities that would provide better data for future operations. The technological improvements in weather forecasting that occurred after World War II would have made Stagg's D-Day forecast substantially easier and more accurate. Radar allowed detection of precipitation and storm systems that surface observations couldn't track comprehensively. Weather satellites provided global observations that eliminated gaps in Atlantic coverage. Computer models allowed systematic analysis of atmospheric dynamics that manual methods couldn't process efficiently. The improvements transformed weather forecasting from primarily judgmental activity that Stagg practiced into more systematic science that combined human expertise with technological capabilities that reduced but didn't eliminate forecast uncertainty. Modern analysis of D-Day weather situation using contemporary forecasting tools confirms that Stagg's prediction about the high-pressure ridge creating brief window was based on recognizing atmospheric pattern that was barely visible in available data. The pattern existed, but its identification required professional skill at interpreting incomplete observations and required understanding atmospheric dynamics well enough to extrapolate how systems would evolve. The modern analysis provides retrospective validation that Stagg's forecast was scientifically sound rather than lucky guess, validates that his professional judgment about atmospheric behavior was accurate, even though data available at the time was insufficient to prove the forecast was correct. Stagg's papers and forecast notes were donated to meteorological archives after his death and became valuable historical resources for understanding weather prediction practices in mid-20th century. The papers show detailed analytical process, but also show how much of forecast decision came down to professional judgment that couldn't be fully documented through objective criteria. The papers revealed that weather forecasting as practiced in 1944 was a blend of science and art, where forecasters had to make decisions that combined data analysis with intuition, developed through experience observing how forecasts compared to actual conditions. The institutional memory of D-Day weather forecast persisted in British Meteorological Office through generations of forecasters who studied Stagg's techniques and who learned from his approach to communicating forecast uncertainty while providing actionable recommendations. The institutional memory emphasized that accurate forecasting required both technical skill and ability to communicate effectively with decision-makers who needed weather information but who didn't need to understand all the technical complexities that produced the forecasts. Stagg had demonstrated both capabilities and became model for how senior meteorologists should interact with military commanders during operations. The German Meteorological Service's failure to predict the invasion window was analyzed extensively after the war by both German and Allied meteorologists interested in understanding why forecasts had diverged so dramatically. The analysis revealed that German forecasters had access to substantially less Atlantic data than Allied forecasters, because Allied air and naval superiority had prevented German weather reconnaissance from operating effectively over ocean areas where critical weather systems developed. The data disadvantage was compounded by analytical approaches that led German meteorologists to different conclusions even when examining similar observations. The competitive advantage that superior weather forecasting provided to Allied forces in D-Day operation was one of several information asymmetries that contributed to invasion success. Allied forces had better intelligence about German dispositions, had better understanding of beach obstacles through reconnaissance, had better weather forecasting through superior observation networks. The cumulative information advantages didn't guarantee success, but they improved probability of success in ways that combat capabilities alone wouldn't have achieved. Stagg's weather forecast was one element in larger pattern of information superiority that characterized Allied planning for Normandy invasion. Stagg received Order of the British Empire for his meteorological work supporting D-Day and other operations, but the citation was vague about specific contributions because forecast details remained classified at the time the award was presented. The vague citation meant most people who knew Stagg received award didn't understand what specifically he had done to deserve recognition. didn't know about the D-Day forecast decision and the pressure he had experienced while making recommendation that influenced invasion timing. The classified nature of his contribution meant recognition was limited to a small circle of people who had been directly involved in invasion planning, rather than being widely known accomplishment that would have enhanced his public reputation. The declassification of D-Day planning documents in 1970s finally allowed Stagg's contribution to become publicly known and allowed historians to analyze forecast decision in detail. The declassification came late in Stagg's life, but allowed him to give interviews about the forecast and to explain his role in invasion planning. The interviews revealed his continued humility about the forecast and his continued emphasis on uncertainty that had characterized original decision rather than retrospective certainty that successful outcome might have justified. The humility was professionally appropriate and was consistent with Stagg's understanding that weather forecasting remained probabilistic even when predictions proved accurate. Modern military meteorology training includes D-Day forecast as case study in decision-making under uncertainty and in communicating forecast information to operational commanders. The case study emphasizes that Stagg's success came from providing clear recommendations despite uncertain data rather than from achieving perfect forecast accuracy, came from understanding what information commanders needed rather than from providing comprehensive meteorological analysis they couldn't use effectively. The lessons remain relevant for contemporary military meteorologists who face similar challenges communicating technical information to decision-makers who need actionable recommendations rather than detailed discussions of atmospheric dynamics. The commemoration of D-Day invasion includes recognition of planning and logistical accomplishments that made operation possible but doesn't prominently feature meteorological forecasting despite its importance to timing decisions. The limited prominence reflects that weather forecasting is invisible when successful. Operations proceed and weather doesn't become limiting factor, while becoming highly visible when forecasts fail and weather causes operational problems. Stagg's successful forecast enabled invasion to proceed without weather becoming disastrous limiting factor, and therefore enabled weather to remain largely invisible in subsequent historical narratives that focused on combat operations rather than on planning decisions. Stagg's post-war career in meteorological service was professionally successful, but was anticlimactic compared to D-Day forecasting responsibility. No subsequent forecast involved decisions with comparable strategic consequences, even though many forecasts were technically challenging and operationally important. The anticlimax was inevitable because D-Day represented extraordinary situation where weather forecast influenced timing of largest military operation in history, represented peak professional responsibility that couldn't be matched through normal meteorological work, regardless of how skilled or important that work was. The weather window that made D-Day possible was fortuitous timing that combined Stagg's accurate forecast with atmospheric conditions that happened to align with operational requirements during narrow period when astronomical factors were suitable for invasion. The fortunate alignment wasn't purely random. Stagg's forecast was based on identifying real atmospheric patterns, but it also involved elements of luck where conditions could easily have evolved differently despite accurate pattern recognition. The combination of skill and fortune that characterized D-Day weather decision was typical of how major historical events often depend on multiple factors, aligning in ways that seem inevitable retrospectively, but which were highly contingent when occurring.